In ancient Rome, Emperor Nero hunts Christians. In prison, the Apostle John sees the apocalypse. In Jerusalem, Jews revolt in all-out war. For them, it's the end of the world. One Christian woman holds the key to a war of angels and demons that will change the future forever. Chronicles of the Apocalypse is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, telling the story of the book of Revelation in the 1st century. 4 supernatural novels. Read them all, from Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, to Judgment, Wrath of the Lamb. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Apocalypse by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
We are officially recording. Brian, welcome back to yet another episode of Through the Black. Simultaneously uploading this on a different channel called Jared 2.0. So wherever you're watching, welcome. And then if you see this on Brian's YouTube channel that has yet to be created but is in the works, then whatever Brian's channel is, you might even see this up there. I don't know where you're watching from, but welcome to this Preterist series on Daniel. We are all the way. What are we doing? Chapter 10. If you've made it this far, congratulations. And I would have to give bonus points if you made it through the first episode that we did on preterism, and then like Matthew 24 that turned into a 15-part series on Revelation that's now turned into a multi-part series on Daniel. If you've seen every one of those, congratulations. You've been part of quite the journey over the last year. So who knew, dude? Who knew that first email that I sent you was going to turn into like 30 shows?
Totally. More hours of podcasting than I've ever done in my life. You've done a lot of it, but 2-hour podcast is very unusual. And I never thought that we'd have that much to talk about, but here we are.
That's the beauty of what we're talking about. So Brian, tell them what we're talking about tonight. Give a recap and your website and all that good stuff.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, Godawa.com is my main website. If you want to find out more information on me, my books and material related to everything we're talking about here, and as well as the commercial that you saw about the Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And so I've written some stuff on eschatology. But in this series, we are drawing as well from a few sources, but a dominant source is Jay Rogers' book, In the Days of These Kings, Preterist Commentary on Daniel, very helpful, but also a little bit from Ken Gentry, Philip Morrow, a little bit from James Jordan, some other writers as well. And because these men are a lot smarter than me, so I read them and they introduce me to some of these fascinating ideas, and then I probe it further and sort of put the things together myself as well. But what we've been looking at in the book of Daniel is, and what we've been dealing with here thematically throughout the whole book has been addressing this notion of what is the context, and the context of Daniel. Is it this futuristic antichrist that's going to come with a great tribulation in the future and the end of time? Or is it the time of the end, which is the 1st century and the time of Messiah? Is Daniel only looking to pointing to the Messiah? And anything beyond that is speculation that doesn't really fit the context. And that, of course, that's the angle we are taking, is that Daniel is really about Daniel's future, but he is pointing to Messiah. He's not pointing to the second coming. He's pointing to the first coming, because news flash, Jesus hadn't come yet, Messiah hadn't come yet. So it was all about Messiah bringing in God's kingdom, and and a kingdom that would ultimately outdo all the other kingdoms, etc. And how that was important to the Babylonian exile, because of course at the time of Daniel we talked about how this is the time of the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon. Daniel, as well as the other many Jerusalemites, many Israelites were taken to Babylon. So they're in the midst of this exile, and Daniel is giving them hope by looking for the future. And they're particularly in the exile. Last week, we talked about Daniel 9, which was in my opinion, probably the most central messianic in the Old Testament, only because it was so specific in terms of its dates, in terms of its years. that Jews were able to pinpoint the rough time of arrival of Messiah, which was a surprise, AD 30, right around that time, or AD 27, or basically around that first century time period. They didn't know exactly, but as they counted out the years, they were seeing that, oh, Messiah should be coming any day. That's why they were looking for him at that time. And of course, that's when Jesus did come. And so that sort of is sort of the proof itself that the prophecy was interpreted that way through the Jews. And the part of the process, or part of the messianic kingdom that would come, had always, throughout the Old Testament, you read this, it always included both redemption and judgment. Redemption and judgment. God brings redemption of his remnant of true believers, but he also brings judgment upon those who reject him, including Israelites, right? And whereas many people think that, oh, the judgment, when Daniel talks about the judgment, it's talking about the future, our future, at the end of time, the last judgment or something like that, or some judgment that's coming thousands of years later. No, actually, we've talked about how Isaiah, as well as Daniel, links the judgment, Daniel 9 linked the coming of Messiah and the judgment on Jerusalem of that city for rejecting Messiah and its destruction. He linked those two together. And of course, Jesus said that they would happen within a generation, 40 years. And sure enough, they did. Jesus died and was resurrected in around AD 33. And within about 40 years, the temple was destroyed. So that's the dominant theme of the coming Messianic kingdom. And when that Old Testament temple was destroyed, that was when the new covenant was historically consummated. It was heavenly consummated at the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ. It was real and it was in effect, but there was a transition period until that Old Testament incarnation was destroyed. There's still a sense in which it was kind of hanging on, and God got rid of it historically and publicly, that old covenant, by destroying that incarnation of the old covenant. So that's what it's all pointing towards, and that's why Daniel's kingdoms in the metal man statue, the strange beasts, and then ultimately in Daniel 7, the ascension of Christ and the bringing of his kingdom was all part of that package. That's what we've been talking about, all these prophecies. But here's the interesting thing too, is that now we're going to be entering into Daniel 10 and 11. This is the fifth vision that is in Daniel that we have committed to talking about. And this, as we've already explained, there is some recapitulation in prophecy. A lot of these prophecies of Daniel have gone over, decades of years, right? So Daniel ends up, he's around till he's like 90 years old, and he's prophesying when he's a young guy. So, decades and decades. So these prophecies are sort of reiterations along the road of, as time goes on, he reiterates some of what he had said earlier was going to come. He gets a new vision that reinforces it or gives you a little bit more information. Well, Daniel, what we're going to talk about today in Daniel 10:11 is the next step in that revelation was, remember, the four kingdoms: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and ultimately ancient Rome. Those are the four kingdoms that would be the times of the Gentiles, where Israel was under the Gentile domination, so to speak, right? Until the kingdom of God comes and frees him from that, right? In time of Jesus. And so those four kingdoms are the things that he keeps going back to, or expands on. And this passage today is going to be expanding on the Greek kingdom, which is the third kingdom right before ancient Rome. And it expands on the whole time period that encompasses what's called 6 Syrian wars. And what that means is that Syria was actually a sort of a place of contention between, I'll just relay out the historical setting of this, which is when Alexander died in around 323 BC. He was the one who began the kingdom of Greece that Daniel's talking about, right? That bronze part of the statue, or I can't remember which beast he was, but the little beastie in Daniel 7. Well, when Alexander dies, his kingdom was split up between the four generals that he had, and it was going to be a tumultuous kingdom because they would fight over it. And there were 4 of the names of the generals, but the 2 most important ones that we're basically going to be focusing on in this passage of Daniel 11 particularly is the northern kingdom, which would be considered the Seleucid kingdom. So Seleucus was one of the generals, and he ended up having it took him some time before his kingdom was established, but the Seleucid kingdom ended up dominating mostly Persia. So it's a big, big kingdom, but what we now know as Iran and such, right? Persia, but also it included a lot of Syria and Israel. And then the other dominant kingdom was in the south, and that was Egypt. And that was ruled over by the Ptolemies. Ptolemy was one of the generals, and they basically had dynastic lines, right? And so the general Ptolemy, or his family dynasty, ruled for a period of time. And those are the 2 kingdoms that we're talking about. Why? Because in the north was the Syrian, or the Seleucid kingdom, actually. And in the south was Egypt. And in between those 2 big crushing, worlds was little old Israel. And that's why Daniel's talking about them, because she's sort of in the middle of their conflicts. Israel experiences this war between these 2 families, so to speak, but really 2 nations. So let's get going in Daniel 10. Daniel 10 is basically the preface to the vision. The vision's in 10, but Daniel 10 is part of it. So I just wanted to touch on a few things. So this is a vision where we're told we're in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. A word was revealed to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. And this is a time when Daniel was fasting. And he gets a vision where he sees a man clothed in linen. This is Daniel 10, verse 4. And he's on the Tigris rivers, on the bank of the Tigris rivers. I lifted my eyes up, and a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. So this is a vision of a man, and then ultimately we're going to see how Gabriel actually becomes part of this as well. Who is this angel, and what's the point? This angel is going to give him this vision. Daniel's going to see the vision, and he's going to get it explained to him. But the interesting thing was, well, first, before I go into that here, I think I may have missed something. Oh, a couple of things. I'm probably going to do there's a lot more historical stuff in Daniel 11. So I'm probably going to be reading more passages than I usually do, because the history can be complex. And I learned a lot reading about it. It's very fascinating. I highly recommend people doing it, but nevertheless, it's like, there's so much that I felt these guys have put it in words better than I can probably quickly summarize it. So I'll be reading some of those passages, but also, 3rd year of Cyrus. Now we're around 535 BC. And let's see, how old is Daniel by this point in time? Well, in the first year, no, sorry, looking ahead too far.
How was he in Daniel 9? He was already like 70, right?
Yeah. So, but because Daniel bounces back and forth between the dates, I neglected to write what his age was at this point. So you'll have to look that up yourselves. He's an older man, because this is now the Persian kingdom that's going to be coming in. But so this is, yeah, trying to get over it. I'll get to the confusing part about Cyrus later, but right now let's just look at this vision. So the interesting thing about this man that he sees is, I think it's probably Jesus, and a lot of commentators say it probably is. And the reason why is he's described exactly the same way as the character in Revelation 1, verses 13 through 16, who most commentators also acknowledge is probably Jesus, because the language is very much deity oriented, right? So you see here, a man is clothed in linen. In Revelation 1, he's clothed in a robe. Here, he's got a gold belt. Revelation 1, he's got a gold sash. Here, his legs are burnished bronze. In Revelation, he's got feet like burnished bronze. Okay, similar language, not exactly the same, but very similar. eyes like flaming fire in Daniel 10, eyes like flaming fire in Revelation 1, a voice like a multitude in Daniel verse 10 or chapter 10, voice like many rivers, I think, or many, I don't know why I wrote roars, many rivers, I think it is in Revelation 1. Double check me on that one.
I think that's more interesting. Roars. I want to know
Yeah.
more about roars now.
Well, here I can see I've got Revelation 1 here.
You are a creative author, so you never know.
No,
when you start...
it is roars. The voice like the roar of many waters.
There you go.
So there you go.
Glad we pressed on that one.
Roar of waters. So yeah, so it's pretty well understood that it's Jesus in Revelation 1. And this man in Daniel also has that transcendence. He's transcended even above Gabriel and Michael, who are described as archangels, not in Daniel, but they are described as archangels in the New Testament. But here, Michael's the, one of the chief princes, right? Not the chief prince. And elsewhere, we've mentioned how this other man that shows up at various times is above Michael, even, and Gabriel. So that's why he's more than likely this is Jesus, right? So Daniel, saw this vision, and going further down in Daniel 10, it says this man speaks to him, this vision of Jesus, and he says, Daniel, greatly beloved, understand the words I speak to you. And when he spoke the word to me, I stood up trembling. Then he said to me, fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before God, your words have been heard. And I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. What does that mean? I draw attention to this more on my own personal interest, because I think this is part of the divine counsel that is very strong throughout Scripture, but it's pretty undeniable in Daniel. In other chapters, people try to reason it away, but it's pretty clear here. Most scholarship admits that these princes are supernatural princes who are over nations or cities. And we've talked about how the notion here is that there were these principalities over the powers on earth. So whenever something happened on earth, a war, there was a war in heaven, because the principle on earth, it is as it is in heaven, like Jesus said, right? In other words, the earthly authorities were tied to the heavenly authorities. So things went on, and they would be reflected in the heavenlies.
Could you say that the Deuteronomy 32 worldview was still an accurate worldview during the time that Daniel wrote these prophecies?
Yeah, I would say so. I would definitely say so. And that's what I think this is reflecting, because don't forget, what's the line of kingdoms in Daniel, right? Persia comes, Medo-Persia is the one that comes and takes over Babylon, right? And that's exactly where we are in the story. And he's saying, but Greece is coming next, right? And so he's this Jesus, who's the prince of the host, he's saying that the prince of the kingdom, now this is the supernatural prince over Persia, withstood him 21 days. What's going on there? Well, some authors or writers have said that this is a reference to the fact that, it's under Cyrus that ultimately the decree, to rebuild Jerusalem happened. So the demonic realm was fighting against that. They don't want that rebuilt, right? And so that's what some suggest this supernatural being was doing, and he was being withstood. But ultimately, he had victory over him because Cyrus did send the decree, right? Cyrus, my anointed. But this is one of those passages where it reflects that theme of the principalities in heaven reflecting what's going on earth. This is why when you have a earthly historical judgment on a nation, a city, or a people, and those authorities fall because, they're conquered by another nation or whatever, the language they use is often the heavenly language, the stars falling from the sky, moon turning blood red and all this, because the heavenly bodies were expressions of the deity or divinities or angelic world, supernatural world that they thought was tied to the earthly world, see? And then another reflection of that is further on down in the chapter, verse 20, Daniel 10. Then he said, do you know why I have come to you? But now I will return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. but I will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth, et cetera, et cetera. So he's saying that this second Grecian kingdom that's coming, there's already that heavenly battle that's going on, that's going to be reflected in the earthly world. So I just think that's a cool confirmation of the divine council motif, or as I call it, actually, the watcher paradigm. That is, that these nations, earthly nations and authorities, have heavenly powers over them that are connected to them.
Let me ask you this real quick. So, because
Sure.
you're a bit different than a lot of people in the Reformed community, as am I. As you've been around preterists a lot more than I have, is that controversial to talk about the Watchers in relationship to this in Daniel? Is the more prevailing theory as a preterist studying Daniel, does it take the supernatural element out of these passages usually?
It sometimes does, but what I have seen in my reading, which is not a lot, is some evangelicals do acknowledge it. Most critical scholars or liberal scholars do tend to believe in the watcher paradigm because they think it's silly, right? I mean, they, well, that's obviously silly, supernatural part. We know that's not true, right? That's how liberals think. They just, they go towards the more, supernatural definitions because to them that I think in their eyes, that makes it look obviously more mythical or something, right?
Like it's stupid. It's easier to pick apart.
But however, though, I think it is more consistent with the ancient paradigm. And so the evangelicals, the conservatives or the confessing scholars do tend to deny that, avoid it, and try to redefine this stuff away because they're afraid of that mythical connection. So, but then there's the evangelicals who are, look, let's face the reality of the ancient Near Eastern context and understand it on its own terms and stop trying to, force it to be protected by our own modern Western, post-Enlightenment Christian view, right? And that's where I consider myself to be in the camp of, I'm not afraid to acknowledge the ancient worldview and how they saw things. And maybe it is more a reflection of reality than what we have, right? Hey, maybe that's actually how things are.
It's sort of like this warped mentality of trying to defend the Bible from what's in it. And that's that we're like, stop making fun of us because it's supernatural. We don't believe it's supernatural. It's like when it clearly is supernatural. It's like, why are we defending God right now? Let's just stand up for him.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right.
However, we don't want to dwell on this because that's not the focus. But the last thing I want to talk about in this passage was in verse 14, when he's telling him, I'm going to give you this vision and explain to you, he says, I came to I was left with the kings of Persia and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision is for days yet to come. Now, this is the part of the passage where a lot of futurists, dispensationalists, not all, and I don't claim to know, everybody has multiple varieties of interpretations. Okay. But this is one of the parts where, as we talked about this in the past, when they see the end, they automatically assume it must be the end of time. Right. And this is another one of those phrases, in the latter days, when they read that and they think, well, this is obviously about the last days, which are in our future. Right. But the problem is that phrase, the latter days, does not mean last days like they think it means. It actually just means in later days. And this is proven, I'm not just saying it, it of course is reflected throughout the Old Covenant, Old Testament, in examples where I would expect that even futurists would admit, yeah, that's true. Latter days means years from now, later years from now, and they were already fulfilled. But let me just say, let me give you some of those examples. We've already talked about how the end is the ends of different time periods. So the end doesn't mean the end of all things, or it could be the end of that particular kingdom. It doesn't, it's all contextual. So latter days, first time, Genesis 49:1, Jacob is talking about his immediate descendants. He says, he called his sons and said, gather yourselves that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. That's the ESV. It's the same Hebrew word as latter days, right? What will happen to you in latter days. And what he tells them is just what happens in history in that time period. It already happened. Numbers 24:14, David is going to be crushing the Moabites, but the prophecy comes out and says, behold, now I'm going to my people. Now behold, I'm going to my people. Come, I will let you know what this people will do to your people in the latter days. And he goes on to describe how David, let's see who I should have wrote down who was saying that. Oh, it's It's Balak. I'm sorry, Balaam. It's Balaam, part of Balaam's oracle. And he describes what happens to them in the latter days. And it's all about the tribes of Israel. And these are things that everyone acknowledges. Okay, this stuff, happened in the past, most of it. Some of it had to do even with Messiah coming, but that's fulfilled at the time of Messiah. So latter days just simply means years from now. Who knows how long? Another case example would be Deuteronomy 4:30. God is speaking through Moses here, I think, and he says, when you are in tribulation, so he's giving him, the laws of God and telling them, if you obey, you'll be blessed. If you don't, you'll be cursed. He says, when you are in tribulation and all these things come upon you in the latter days, because you don't obey me, you will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. And this, of course, what he's talking about in context is the period of Judges, which did happen, where there was great tribulation of the judges. They disobeyed, but then they would also return to the Lord, right? Like, they would have reforms and stuff under various righteous kings. And so there's a case again where he's saying this is going to happen to you in the latter days, and those latter days were fulfilled in the day of Judges. There's another dozen examples of this, that you can go through. And I think I actually have all these in my booklet called Matthew 24 Fulfilled. You can get that on Amazon.com. And it's basically research for things like last days and end times and stuff like that. Bible verses, So anyway, you get my point. So latter days is just simply later days from now, and it's not the last days of time. So this is but it's interesting because I do think that this is why a lot of them not a lot, but I've heard some futurists interpret Daniel 11 as something that is yet to happen in our future. So they think this stuff has to do with the Antichrist and all this stuff. I can't tell you all the speculative details because it's all speculative, like science fiction. But now we're going to go through that vision that Daniel has, and it's explained by Gabriel. I'm sorry, no, it's not. It's actually explained. I'm pretty sure it's explained by Jesus, by the vision of Jesus, because remember how the Bible is not made into chapters like we read them. There were never original chapters. It was all straight through. And so sometimes when we read a chapter division, we think it's literally divided conceptually, but sometimes it's not. It's just a continuation of what's been said, right? And so this is an example of that, where 10 is this setup. He sees the man. This Son of Man. I don't know what I want to call him Jesus, but just to be consistent with the text, this visionary angel that he's seeing. He's talking to him and he's telling him, this stuff is happening, but the vision I'm giving you is true. And then he says, and as for me, which is still the Jesus talking, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. So it starts in Daniel 10 as the third year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. Then he says, now he's referring back to the first year of Darius the Mede. So he's referring back to something in the past. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I think it's important to know some of the apologetic elements of a text, because this is one of the parts where liberals will try to discredit the book of Daniel because there's some problems with Darius the Mede. And the biggest problem is that there's no evidence of a Darius the Mede in between in ruling over Babylon in between Belteshazzar, I think it is, and Cyrus. So liberals will say, so this is either a made up guy or he's a conglomeration of a later Darius. They say because we don't know of any Darius the Mede over Babylon, then it can't be, right? And there's also some confusion, wait a minute, in the first year of Darius the Mede and the third year of Cyrus, how does that all work? Well, if you look at all the passages, what it says about Darius and Cyrus, one of the ways that is explaining this is J. Rogers. And J. Rogers says, he takes and it's not just him. I mean, this is a whole branch of other scholars who will say that, remember, the Medo-Persian kingdom at this time was a sort of a dual kingdom, but the Persians were stronger, and Cyrus was that horn that was stronger, right? So at this point, yeah, Babylon gets conquered, and Darius the Mede is appointed by Cyrus to be king over Babylon, while Cyrus is in Persia taking care of his stuff, right? And so the first year of Darius the Mede is actually during Cyrus's kingdom. And don't forget, the third year of Cyrus is something that he's referring back to the first year. So the argument here is that basically Darius lived 1 year, and there's some evidence within the text that that's all there is. He just lived 1 year and he died. And so, but Cyrus was always the Persian king. Darius was the Mede king, right? So he was replaced, and so that's one way of explaining it. And another way of explaining it is that Darius was actually, we've seen this over and over again in the ancient world. Different rulers have different names from different cultures and nations, and sometimes they'll give them two names, So one argument is that this Darius was actually one of the generals who was, I don't know, his name was Garupta or something like that. I don't know if I wrote that down, but one of the ideas is that it's another name for this general who conquered the city, and he was appointed to be ruler over it, right? But there are problems with that as well. And again, I'm going to leave the apologetics for later. I'll just conclude with one of the other strong examples. And this is interesting because the third one is that Darius and Cyrus are the same person. And there's an argument within the text that that's the case. First of all, it says that this is the simplest way of explaining it. And it goes back to Daniel 6:28. And in the Hebrew, it says, or I'm sorry, in the English, we read, Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And that seems to match this idea that it's either two different reigns or, it's the Medo-Persian reign. On the surface, it seems to appear that way. But in the Hebrew, some scholars will suggest that no, actually the best way of interpreting that, it's, I won't go into, the grammar because I don't know that's above my pay grade, but they basically say the grammar can be better explained as it's saying, actually, Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, that is, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So he's giving two names for the same person. And there is examples of that in the biblical text. The classic case is 1 Chronicles 5:26, where it says, so the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he took them into exile. So it's talking about the Assyrian exile of Israel, right? And there's a case where he's saying these two names. He says the first name, that is the second name, right? So this could actually be a case for that. What I found interesting, and this is why, you have to always be open-minded. Josh McDowell, back in the late 70s, wrote a book, Daniel in the Lion's Den, and he argued against this viewpoint that it was the same person. And he actually argued that it was probably this general Garupta or whatever, and he was just given a new name not given a new name, but he was referred to by a different name. But over the years and over different scholarship, now if you read that book's been updated, now he takes the view that Cyrus and Darius are the same person. It's interesting, before he discredited it, and now he supports it. And that just goes to show you that it's a difficult problem, and there's no rock solid solution. Okay. So if you want to get into those details and try to make the argument to support it, fine. That's not our purpose here, apologetics as much as prophecy, but it still was an interesting context that if you love learning things about the scripture, it's a great
well, that's
thing
also
to read more about.
That's also why it's important to do it in an expository fashion, because it forces you to handle every sentence of scripture. Like, see, I've never done an expository study of Daniel, and I've never once in my life questioned who Darius the Mede was. Not once. I've probably read that passage in passing a million times, but that's cool. Now all of a sudden I know there's controversy here. This is an interesting subject all of a sudden. So
yeah, exactly. So, but for now, I mean, for the sake of the argument, I'll just read what Rogers wrote. When Babylon was subdued by the Medes and Persians, Darius took command of the empire. The two rulers, Cyrus, that is Persian, right, and Darius the Mede, began to rule simultaneously. Cyrus ruled for 3 years, but Darius ruled for just 1 year. Although the vision occurs in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus the Persian, Daniel was previously being told by the angel about events 3 years earlier during the reign of Darius the Mede. So, in other words, it's a displacement of time, and so who knows exactly what's going on there. But nonetheless, let's get back to the prophecy. Let's keep moving forward, because now we're going to talk about the prophecy of the kings of the south and the north, and we're going to talk about most of the passage, which talks about the 6 Syrian wars that were about to occur, and we're going to stop just short of the last king that's there, and I'll explain why later. But we've got enough material to cover. So, first year of Darius the Mede, Daniel 11, verse 2. I will show you the truth. So he's saying, he's giving the explanation. The vision of Jesus, I argue, is explaining his vision to Daniel, and he says, "Now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall rise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. As soon as he has risen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, not according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside these." All right, this is talking about hold on a second here. Okay, so this is talking about the end of the Persian kingdom and the rise of Alexander the Great. Remember, recapitulation, Daniel's resetting us, whereas he's talked already about the Nebuchadnezzar, we've had prophecies about the Babylonians, and we've also heard stuff about the Medes and the Persians, and now he's going to go into that 3rd kingdom of Greece that is throughout the book of Daniel. Now he's going to focus in on that 3rd kingdom, more of that history of the times of the Gentiles, right? And so he introduces by saying, "Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia," right? So these would probably be the last 4 kings were Cyrus, Cambyses, Smerdis, Darius Hystaspes, and Xerxes the First. And but what most suggest is 3 more kings. They're talking about after Cyrus. So the 3 kings that they're focusing on ends with Xerxes the First, because he was the richest of them all, and he was the last one before Alexander the Great. And so here's what Duncan McKenzie writes. Let's see. Hold on a second. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me see. What do I want to read here? Yeah, let me just jump into these. So these 3 kings shall rise in Persia. A 4th shall be richer. That's Xerxes the First. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall rise. So this 4th, Duncan McKenzie, who's also got an interesting commentary called it's so hard. Oh, there it is. I got it right there. The Antichrist and the Second Coming, a Preterist Examination, Volume 1. He writes that Xerxes the First, which was around 486 to 465 BC, is clearly identified as the 4th king by the description of his great wealth and expedition against Greece. Almost all commentators agree, however, that the king in the next verse is Alexander the Great, who ruled from, born 336 BC, died in 323 BC. This leaves a gap of some years of intervening kings. Well, I don't think it does, but we'll look at that. But this mighty king that shall arise. So the focus here is on, remember, the focus is on the kings that are relevant to Israel's destiny and history. So even though there's a tight chronological order of kingdoms, we're not going to cover all the kings. So there might be jumping a few years here and there between kings, but the kingdoms are chronological, if that makes sense. In other words, you don't have to hear about every single king. That would fill books and books, right? So what I'm saying here is that there are going to be some years and some decades that might jump, but they're still within the same kingdom. So that does not justify inserting 2,000-year gaps where many futurists often do, because the kingdoms are the things that are continuous. So a mighty king shall rise. Like I said, that is, let me read. There's something else I think I want to read here if I can find it. No, I guess I've jumped in it. Okay. Oh, there it is, fourth. No, I'll just keep moving. So, because it doesn't stay with Alexander. We talked about Alexander in previous prophecies, so they want to get moving past him. So he says, then a mighty king shall rise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. This is Alexander the Great. Now, this phrase, do as he wills, is another repetitious prophetic phrase that relates to a lot of these kings. We're going to see this phrase, do as he wills, or something similar to that effect, but also throughout all of Daniel. So this is one of those repetitious phrases that basically we've already explained in the past, that it basically means it's this willful king. In other words, he acts like a god. He does the things that a god does because he thinks he's a god. That's the basic notion behind it. Does as he wills, like God does as he wills, right? And so the phrase is used of Alexander the Great here in Daniel 11:3. It's used of Antiochus the Great in Daniel 11:16, which we're going to see in a bit. That phrase, do as he wills. It's used of Antiochus the Fourth. I'm sorry, I said Antiochus the Great. That's Antiochus the Third. It's also used of Antiochus the Fourth in Daniel 11:28, which we'll see tonight as well. And it's also used in Daniel 11:36 of one of these characters in history, the Caesars, Herod, or Titus. We'll go through that next week. But my point here is this willful king is a concept that unites them all in rebellion against God. Got it? Makes sense. So again, when you see this phrase, it doesn't mean it's the same thing, the same king as the other kings. As soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven. Now, we've seen this multiple times in the past, right? The four horns that come up on the animal, and this is the four generals. They call them the Diadochi, the four generals who succeeded Alexander. I've already mentioned Ptolemy in Egypt in the south, Seleucus in Asia in the north, which includes also part of Syria and Persia, Lysimachus and Cassander. And Lysimachus and Cassander had like areas like in Greece and in further west. So we're focusing on the ones in the east because that's where Israel is. So this is not just another reflection. His kingdom was broken up into the four generals, right? But not to his posterity, nor according to the authority which he ruled, which means those weren't his kids. Alexander didn't have any heirs, right? So these four generals were not his posterity, and they didn't have the same authority that he had. So they ended up warring with each other for, I don't know, a couple hundred years or whatever. And so this is reflecting that coming reality. Now we're going to be talking about the kings of the south and of the north. And there's something about this prophecy. It starts in Daniel 11, verse 5, which is the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule. We're going to be seeing this. There's some ambiguity throughout this text where the phrase king of the south and king of the north are used, never names. And they're used throughout the passage to refer to different kings of north and south. So it can cause a lot of confusion. Futurists often tend to think that it's all the same. There's only one king of the north and one king of the south, right? And it just, or there might be a few, but we're going to see how this is fulfilled in history. But it's confusing to many people because the name king of the north, king of the south keeps being reused. It's like, which king of the north are we talking about here, right? And it also refers to these kings' actions, and it just says, he does this, he does that, he does this, he does that. And sometimes you're going, well, who's he? The king of the north or the king of the south? So there's a potential for a lot of confusion in this passage, but we're going to see that it's actually quite boring history in one sense, in that it's going to ultimately lead to the rise of Messiah and the rise of ancient Rome, actually, which is the time period of Messiah that's coming. So this first passage it begins in 11 verse 5, and let me just read through it. This is addressing the first two Syrian wars. I've told you that there's 6 Syrian wars that are going to be covered in this passage. Roughly, they're consecutive, one after the other, and it's these Egypt battling with Seleucia or Syria. That's another word that they call, the Seleucid kingdom, because it controlled Syria, and that was the sort of the focus point. The king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. I think I'll try to do this step at a time. This verse, I think, is referring to the first 2 Syrian wars. It's sort of rushing over them quickly in a way, but here's what happened. So remember this: whenever you hear the word south, think Egypt. Whenever you hear north, think Syria. South Egypt. Also, whenever you hear south, think Ptolemies, the Ptolemy kingdom. Whenever you hear north, think Syria or the Seleucid kingdom. All right. Another thing you might think is when you hear me talking about the name Antiochus, those are usually various kings under the Seleucid kingdom in the north, but pretty much most all the kings in the south are referred to as Ptolemies. So that kind of helps you keep it placed. But basically, so from my reckoning, about 49 years after Alexander's death in 323 BC, the first Syrian war starts. That's 274 BC, and it goes for a few years, the first Syrian war. And so what happened was, this was Ptolemy II of Egypt versus Antiochus I of Syria. So the first war breaks out. Ptolemy ultimately takes Syrian areas and southern Anatolia. That's part of the kingdom of the Seleucids. This is where it says the kingdom of the south shall be strong, right? When it says one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, I think this refers to who's the he, whose princes. This is, I don't think this is referring to one of the kings of the south princes, but it's referring back to the dominant, which was Alexander, one of Alexander's princes. It's not the king of the south, Alexander. One of his princes is the Seleucid kingdom, Seleucid king Antiochus II, who succeeded Antiochus I. And the reason why I say that was because Antiochus II becomes king in 261 BC, and Antiochus II then turns around and Ptolemy did well against Antiochus I, but Antiochus II is stronger, and he has victory over Ptolemy II. So the problem is that most information, historical information on this war is lost to history. So you could even read this stuff in Wikipedia. I wouldn't recommend Wikipedia for anything having to do with, with any political or questions of documentation, but it's a good primer on just the basic roughs of what happened in the Syrian wars. You look up the Syrian wars. But so what I'm saying here is that these first 2 wars are encompassed in this verse, and then the results of it are continued on in verse 6. Because what happens is the war ends, Antiochus II has victory over Ptolemy II. The war ends with Ptolemy's daughter Berenice being married to Antiochus. All right. Oftentimes when they won wars, in order to assure a continuing subordination, there would be a marriage of one of the children into the other kingdom so that they could sort of keep an eye on them, right? Or, it would be a way to cement that treaty, so to speak. So this is a common thing that occurs. And what happens is the very next verse, Daniel 11:6 says, after some years, they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. See, that's Berenice of Ptolemy marrying. That's the agreement that they make. And she marries for that truce, that alliance, right? But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up. So in other words, that alliance won't endure. She shall be given up. I think that's a reference to her murder, and her attendants, he who fathered her and he who supported her in those times. What I think this is referring to is the fact that Berenice is murdered. She's assassinated. So Antiochus marries Berenice. And, well, actually, I'm sorry. Berenice is murdered. I'm sorry. I want to get this right.
It's a lot of history. Real quick,
Yeah.
is that where you got the name Berenice in Chronicles of the Apocalypse?
Yeah. If you read it, it looks like Bernice.
Mhm.
But I've heard that the Greek pronunciation is Berenice. I picked that up and I couldn't get rid of it. I
Yeah.
like Berenice is easier to say, but I just picked it up. And
Well, that's what's funny. I listened to it on Audible. I listened to all 4 of them on Audible. So I only ever heard Berenice. I never even saw it spelled. So when you said it again, I was like, I know that name.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
all right, that's where you got it.
So she's given up, which means she was murdered. And he who fathered her is Ptolemy II. He dies, and Ptolemy III takes the throne. All right. But in particular, though, what actually happens is Antiochus marries Berenice from Egypt, and he repudiates his previous wife, Laodice. And then, in order to marry Berenice, right? Now, kings can, of course, marry whoever they want, but for some reason, he was taking on Berenice, and so he was repudiating his previous wife. And that previous wife, Laodice, poisons Antiochus and kills him and Berenice. Why? Because competition for the throne. Berenice's sons were going to be the ones who would take the throne, and Laodice wouldn't have it. She wanted her son to take the throne, so she poisons them both. And she calls for her brother Ptolemy III, who is now the new king of Egypt. That's her brother, to come and help her son take the throne. I'm jumping a little bit ahead, and I apologize for that.
It's interesting history.
That happens before.
I guarantee you it's history most people have never touched.
Yeah. So first of all, when Berenice marries, then she calls for her brother Ptolemy. They're having this, she's war with Laodice, right? And so to speak. And she wants her brother to come up and help her, claim the throne with her sons. There was a king of Egypt who had some authority to demand that, right? But the problem is that while he's on his way, that's when Laodice poisons Berenice and her son. They're assassinated before Ptolemy arrives. So when he arrives, his sister's dead. And of course, and then Laodice's son, Seleucus II, takes the throne. This leads to the Third Syrian War, which we see in the next verse, verse 7. And from a branch from her roots, one shall arise in his place. A branch from her roots means her brother, right? Their brother came from the same roots. The brother of the murdered Berenice. Ptolemy III becomes king after Ptolemy dies, and he takes his place. And it says, he shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. Remember, that's Syria, that's the Seleucids. So Ptolemy's going to come against so this is the Third Syrian War that verse 7 is talking about. That was a result of the consequences of the last war. And it says, he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years, he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north, Syria, Antiochus. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his land. So these are just events that would occur before the next Syrian war. But the Third Syrian War happens. And let's see, what did I write here? Whoops, my notes are screwing up again here. Sorry. Which I definitely need the notes. So what happens is Ptolemy starts that war because his sister was murdered. He occupies Antioch, which is in the north, which is a key fortress city in Syria. And he even reaches to Babylon, which is also part of this, part of the heart of the Seleucid kingdom. So Ptolemy has great success. And that's what's being described here, in that he shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north and shall prevail and carry off to Egypt. So the Egyptians, through Ptolemy III, has some success and takes back some of these fortress city, and more than Antioch, but that was one of the key cities, right, of the king of the north. And then it says, then the latter, the king of the north. Now, so we're talking the king of the north, which is Seleucus II. He now shall come into the realm of the king of the south, which is Egypt and Ptolemy, but shall return to his own land. So in other words, there's a time there where he, he's going to try to take some back, but he can't. So the South basically has dominion over the North. And that's that for the Third Syrian War. Then in verse 10, we have the Fourth Syrian War is talked about, which is next after that. And what it says is, if I can get my notes here. So here's what happens historically was Seleucus III and Antiochus III, which I like to remember him as Antiochus the Great, because he was a very key figure in history, Antiochus the Great. Seleucus III campaigns in Asia Minor in order to take back those kingdoms from Egypt, but he's murdered the years. And he's called the Great because he reestablishes the Seleucid control over Media and Persia, which had been in rebellion. So the Seleucid kingdom has Media and Persia as well as Syria. They lose some of it to Egypt, and Media and Persia, there's a rebellion at that time. And Antiochus, when he comes to the throne, he's the one who quells the rebellion, gets power back over, Persia, Media and Persia. Again, the Seleucid kingdom is more stabilized, and he also gets back Syria. Now, this period is interesting because I have written a book that takes place in this time period, and I even have Antiochus the Great in it. It's one of my novels called Qin, Dragon Emperor of China. It's in the Chronicles of the Watchers series, and I write about this time period of Alexander the Great. He shows up in it, but he's not the main character. I have some fictional characters going on, but it's in this same exact time period. So I have the Greeks interacting with the Babylonians as well as with China, which is kind of interesting. But just wanted to throw that in as an interest. If you, I like it. It's one of my shorter novels, so it's very quick and readable. But anyway, so back to our story here. Antiochus the Great reestablishes that Seleucid control. He recaptures some of the Syrian cities in Phoenicia, that's along the coast, like Seleucia, Perea, which is a key city for them, and Tyre. Egypt also had Tyre. Then he waits a year to invade Egypt, and then he ultimately wants to invade Egypt, and then he does. Meanwhile, down in Egypt, Ptolemy IV was a young king in Egypt, but he was so young that he was manipulated by his advisors. All right. And his advisors got him to raise an army and fought against Antiochus the Great in the Battle of Raphia, which occurred in 217 BC. And he reestablishes control over Syria, but is severely weakened by it all. So that's what's happening historically in this time period. Let's see how that takes place in Daniel. He, let's see here. Okay. His son. So we're back to verse 10, the king of the north. It says, he returns to his land, but his sons shall wage war. So now we're in the Fourth Syrian War, and his sons were Seleucus III and Antiochus the Great. And I already explained what happened with them. And it ends up being Antiochus the Great, who's the one who really ends up following through. And it says, which shall, sorry, my notes are not always working smoothly for me here. Whoops, that didn't work well. Oh man, I totally lost my place here. Give me a second.
No worries. No worries. It's funny. It's confusing for me because I've been studying First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, and there's a lot of Syria, Assyria, the north, South Judah, North Israel, and then in Daniel we're switching gears to North and South, each have two different locations, and I'm just like, what is happening?
Totally. And like I said, as you can see, even as I was reading, it was all making sense. It still can be confusing, which is why I wrote all these notes down. But and now I lost my place, but I found it back again. So here we are. Cool. So his son shall wage war. So now we're into the Fourth Syrian War, and let me get my notes here. Antiochus III, king of the north, takes land from the south, but returns to Syria. So it says, he shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. In other words, that fortress that was taken, and the fortress could be a fortified city. It doesn't have to be a castle or something like that, but some kind of fortification. And he goes as far, in other words, he goes as far as Syria. And why? Because Syria was a lot of the contested area that Egypt and Seleucid kingdom were fighting over, right? And it says that then the king of the south, remember that's Ptolemy of Egypt, this is Ptolemy the fourth, still the same Ptolemy, moved with rage. So when Antiochus comes and takes back Syria, he's moved with rage, Ptolemy, he comes out and fights against the king of the north, which is Antiochus the Great. And so in other words, the king of Egypt responds to that push by Antiochus the Great. And Egypt defeats Seleucia in the Battle of Raphia, which I mentioned was 217 BC. Now here's what John Walton says. This is another commentary that I thought was somewhat helpful. They're somewhat liberal at times, but in this particular part of the Daniel, it was very helpful. He writes that the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC was a major defeat for Antiochus, whose army was decimated, restoring Palestine and much of Syria to Ptolemaic or Egyptian control. However, Ptolemy IV did not capitalize any further on his victory. The status quo held until his death in mysterious circumstances in 203 BC. So this is where Daniel talks about the king of the south moved with rage, comes out to fight against the king of the north. He raises a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. So he takes it back in the Battle of Raphia. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. So in other words, Ptolemy takes back some of it, but it's not a complete victory. And then, because he doesn't prevail because he dies in mysterious circumstances. Then in verse 13 of Daniel 10, it says, for the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first. So in response to this Egyptian sort of taking back of some land, Antiochus the Great now uses that, and he raises an army to strike back. So here's what happens in the Fifth Syrian War, which starts in 202 BC, goes to 195 BC, about 7 years. Ptolemy dies mysteriously, like I mentioned, Ptolemy the Fourth. It plunges Egypt into chaos of contenders for the throne, because Ptolemy the Fifth is so young. The next one, that's what causes it. People, he can't rule us. We need a ruler. So it becomes this contention for the throne. And what happens is what's called the Egyptian revolt at that time. And what happened was those who had battled in the Battle of Raphia, it creates instability in Egypt because they're like, well, this young king isn't enough to rule us. And we won the Battle of Raphia. So they rise up and there's all this turmoil in Egypt. And so it says that he raises Antiochus the Great raises a multitude, verse 13, greater than the first. And after some years, he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. And verse 14, in those times, many shall rise up against the king of the south, Ptolemy of Egypt, and the violent among your people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. That's that Egyptian revolt, and that's that rising up against the young Ptolemy, right? But it fails. So it's all this turmoil, and it ends up failing. And Antiochus the Great uses that Egyptian turmoil as a reason to attack Kol Syria. Kol Syria was a key area around the Lebanon mountains, and it becomes a victorious sweep. And so Antiochus uses that to his benefit, right? And here's what's interesting. Verse 14, in those times, many shall rise against the king of the south. There it is again, that Egyptian revolt. And let me just read what was written by some commentators. The conflict began with the murder of the dead King Ptolemy IV's wife and sister by these two ministers called, this is in Egypt, Agathocles and Ctesibius. Agathocles seems to have held the regency for some time until he was lynched by the volatile Alexandrian mob. The regency was passed from one advisor to another, and the kingdom was in a state of near anarchy. So yeah, that's just reinforcing that historical thing that that Daniel's referring to here. So in those times, many shall rise and the violence among your people. Then the king of the north, in the midst of that turmoil, right? And the king of the north, verse 15, shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against them shall do as he wills. There it is again, do as he wills. That's Alexander, Antiochus the Great, and none shall stand before him. This is that reference to Antiochus seeing the turmoil in Egypt going bad, the leadership's falling apart. So this is his key. So he goes and he fights for Kol Syria. And particularly there was a battle called, which I think this is what this is referring to, the Battle of Panium. And it took place at the city called Panias. This is a key city for this region in the Lebanon range. It is also a city where they worship the god Pan and chaos and stuff. And this city is interesting. It's at the foot of Mount Hermon. And for those who are in the Divine Council Worldview and my novel series, this city is very crucial in a lot of the historical elements of my novel series as well, because it was considered where the gates of Hades were, a cave in the hills where that were in the hills of Mount Hermon, where they thought, the Watchers came down, and they thought that in the cave there of Panias or Pan, they thought was the entrance to the abyss. So it's very interesting, fascinating concepts. But there's this battle at Panias, key city in the region. Antiochus defeats the Egyptians and ended up getting control of Sidon, another key fortified city as well on the coast. And it was key for trade throughout the nations of the world. He gets control of Gaza and other Syrian cities. So others think that this reference to the king of the north, throw up siege works, take a well-fortified city. Some say that's the capture of Sidon by Antiochus, because Sidon was also a well-fortified city. And it was a crucial city on the coast. So, who knows which one they could be, but I think it was the Battle of Panium, because that was more crucial, because also that Battle of Panium then led to the control of the land of Israel, because that was a key part of Canaan there. Then it says, he shall come against him and do as he wills. That's Antiochus the Great. None shall stand. So Antiochus captures it all back, right? And then it says, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. This is why these wars are relevant, because Israel is in the midst of the glorious land is obviously Israel. And it's saying what happened, which was Antiochus the Great beats Ptolemy's armies at the Battle of Panium. Like I said, that leads to his control of Judea from Seleucia. That leads to the control. Wait a minute, I'm losing my space here. I'm misreading my notes. No, I wrote something wrong in my notes here. So it leads to control of Judea. So Antiochus the Great now stands in Judea, basically in the glorious land, with destruction in his hand, right? So again, Israel's in the midst of these two warring nations, and she just gets bludgeoned, Then in verse 17, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. I think that's referring to Antiochus the Great hatches a plot to make Egypt subservient to Syria. And here's what it is. It says in that very verse, he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. What happened? Antiochus the Great gave his daughter Cleopatra the first, called Syra, to Ptolemy V in a peace treaty. Remember, marriages in peace treaties, in order to influence him. But the plot didn't succeed because Cleopatra took the interests of her husband more to heart than those of her father. Jay Rogers writes this in his book. So the idea there was that it fits this perfectly in that he gets this plot, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage, because Cleopatra ends up siding with, this isn't the Cleopatra that we know of history, that, that's later. there's lots of Cleopatras in history, lots of Berenices, lots of Antiochuses, lots of Ptolemies. It's confusing. And lots of he's that you don't know who he's talking about. So he gives the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but shall not stand as advantage. So Antiochus's plot fails because Cleopatra sides with Ptolemy. Afterward, he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them. This, I think, is a reference to what happened next, which was part of the Fifth Syrian War, but it was also called the Roman Seleucid War, which means, let me read this passage as Jay Rogers sort of redoes this Daniel verse and puts the names of the people in place. After this shall Antiochus the Great turn his face unto the isles, Greece and Rome, and shall take many, the Ptolemaic coastal cities. So Greece and Rome had some of those coastal cities in Phoenicia, and he takes those. But a prince, Roman Scipio Asiaticus, for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him, Antiochus the Great, to cease. Without his own reproach, he, Scipio Asiaticus, shall cause it to turn upon him in the battle of Magnesia. Now, all that probably sounds very confusing to you, because if you're like me, I'd never heard of those before. So look that up and read it, and it's quite fascinating. But if I can try to simplify that, let me read, let's see here. Okay, this is from Wikipedia. All right, so this isn't even a source trying to prove the Bible. Antiochus then moved to Asia Minor by land and by sea to secure the coastal towns which belonged to the remnants of Ptolemaic overseas dominions and the independent Greek cities. So along the coast of Asia Minor, those Greek cities, which Greece is in the distance, right? But they own those cities. So Antiochus sets his mind on them, which is like warring with Greece and Rome. And these enterprises earned him the antagonism of the Roman Republic. Rome was a republic at that time and rising in power. And the tension grew when Antiochus in 196 BC established a footing in Thrace. So Thrace is far distant in Asia Minor, and it's part of the Greek Empire. And that's when it starts causing those problems, right? So this is where Daniel 10 says, verse 18, afterward, he, Antiochus the Great, shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. So one of the commanders, Jay Rogers argues that commander that puts an end to the insolence of Antiochus is Scipio Asiaticus, the Roman general, who overthrew Antiochus in the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. So he basically made him submit to dishonorable terms before he would end the war, and he caused the reproach of the Romans to turn back against Antiochus. So that's where it's saying a commander put an end to the insolence of Antiochus the Great, turned him back against him, and made him humiliated, right? But then verse 19 says, then he shall turn his face. Who's that? It's probably Scipio Asiaticus. That commander shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. So Rogers makes the argument that this is still Scipio Asiaticus, the guy who defeats Antiochus and humiliates him. Rogers writes, Scipio is here called a prince who shall cause the reproach because he overthrew Antiochus, made him submit to very dishonorable terms in the Treaty of Apamea, 190 BC, before he would end the war. And then it says that, some of the terms of that treaty were Antiochus had to abandon all of Europe and West Asia, which was part of that Seleucid kingdom. He had to give up all his war elements, giving up your power. He was only allowed 12 warships, and he had to pay for the war, and he had to surrender all prisoners and hostages of his enemies. He had to give them back, and he had to surrender hostages to Rome yearly. So this is clearly a very humiliating insolence, right? That's turned back on him. But Scipio then turns against him, and in 187 BC, first let me get this right. So Rogers argues that Scipio Asiaticus turned to make war against the Romans, but was defeated by Scipio Africanus, another general. Antiochus, meanwhile, returns to his own land and was slain by his people. So In 187 BC, John Walton writes about this in the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary. He writes, in 187 BC, Antiochus and his followers were assassinated by the local people when he tried to plunder the treasury of the temple of Bel in Elmis in Persia in order to pay his tribute to Rome. So back to Daniel 10, that commander that turned Antiochus' insolence against him, verse 18, he turns and goes against Rome. He fails and shall not be found. And Antiochus also is killed by his own people. Now we're into verse 20. Then shall arise in his place. Whose place? I think this is the context is Antiochus the Great because he dies. So who arises in his place, right? Oh, my notes went crazy again. Let me read the passage here. Then one shall arise in his place, in the place of Antiochus the Great, one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. Who's that? Well, Antiochus the Great's successor was Seleucus IV Philopator, another Seleucus IV. He sends a guy named Heliodorus to plunder the temple at Jerusalem. Again, this is why it's relevant. He plunders the temple at Jerusalem, and in obedience to Seleucus, but that same general who plunders the temple turns around and slays Seleucus IV, right? So this is why it says, one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. The glory of the kingdom is obviously God's kingdom, the kingdom of Israel in that context. But within a few days, he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. So that's describing his brokenness is Heliodorus comes back and assassinates him. And it's not in battle. He's assassinated, right? And in his place shall arise. So in the place of Seleucus IV, who's been executed by Heliodorus, in his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. Other translations use the term, I like it better, called a vile person. This is ultimately Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And Antiochus Epiphanes IV is one of the key figures, I think, in Danielic prophecy, because he's that abomination of desolation. He's part of the Maccabean conflict, right? He's the one that the Maccabees rose up, and we talked about him in the last episode, right? Or previous episodes. There a little bit about him, but there's going to be more about him here. And Antiochus Epiphanes is infamous because he's the one who he reigns from 175 BC to about 164 BC, and he's not in line to be king, but he usurps power after Heliodorus assassinates Antiochus's brother. So Antiochus is the brother of Seleucus Philopator, but he's not the one in line until then. So what happens is Epiphanes' brother Demetrius was actually next in line, but he's one of the hostages in Rome that Antiochus was supposed to do every year. And Epiphanes had been switched out for Demetrius and was now living in Athens. So Epiphanes had once been under Roman hostage, but now he's in Athens, so he can come back home. And while Demetrius is a hostage in Rome, Epiphanes is able to take the throne. And Epiphanes dethrones Heliodorus without bloodshed. So Heliodorus was not really received as king. So that's what it's talking about here when it says a vile person to whom royal majesty was not been given. It was supposed to be Demetrius, not Epiphanes. Epiphanes nonetheless takes power. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Right? So he's able to flatter and get his way, while Demetrius as a hostage who can't speak for himself. And then in verse 23, it says, and from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. What does that mean? Well, what happened was historically, Epiphanes renews a treaty and alliance with Rome to keep them from using a heavy hand against Seleucia, because Epiphanes has some designs, right? And so an alliance is made with him, but he acts deceitfully. So he makes an alliance with Rome so that he can accomplish his deeds. So Egypt, in the meanwhile, demands Kol Syria back in 170 BC. So Egypt is looking on what's going on. He goes, oh, we want Kol Syria back. But Epiphanes consolidates power as the new king in Seleucia, and he fortifies for a war with the south. This is where it says, and from the time that alliance is made, he shall act deceitfully, become strong with the small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds but only for a time. What is that? So Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, usurps power, though he's not in line to be king, right? And that was something that neither him or his fathers had done. They had always been in line in succession, but he wasn't. So he did what they didn't do. And then scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods, he shall devise plan against the strongholds. Antiochus Epiphanes plunders the temple at Jerusalem and builds up a military power to get ready for war. Now we come to verse 25. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south. Now we're into the 6th Syrian war, which begins in 170 BC, goes to about 168 BC, so only a couple of years. This war is Antiochus Epiphanes, that vile person, attacks Ptolemy VI of Egypt. So by now in Egypt, Ptolemy VI, he's the king of Egypt at that time. And Antiochus is successful. He gains control of Egypt, except for Alexandria. All right. So that's what's going to happen historically. Let's see what Daniel says. He stirs up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. That's the beginning of that 6th Syrian war. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand. Ptolemy of Egypt attacks Antiochus Epiphanes, but he loses. Plots shall be devised against him. This is against Ptolemy. When Ptolemy's mother died, he was still young, and real power laid with his courtiers. I already mentioned this earlier, right? So that's where the plots are devised against him. They're using him, manipulating him, right? And they seem to have encouraged him to recover Palestine from Epiphanes, the land of Israel, which provoked Epiphanes to attack, right? And after Epiphanes' invasion, they encouraged him to flee to Samothrace, but he was captured by Epiphanes. Then his younger brother, the next Ptolemy, Ptolemy VII, was declared king by Alexandrian quarters. So that's the plots that actually ended up happening against him and how he lost power. Plots shall be devised against him. Verse 26, even those who eat his food shall break him. Right? That's exactly what happened. Those who were within his own court actually broke him and overthrew him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Verse 27, and as for the 2 kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. For the end is yet to be at the appointed time. What is that? Well, the 2 kings, remember now, this is north and south. 2 kings are Antiochus made an alliance with Ptolemy VI. Let's say Epiphanes, so you can remember that. And Epiphanes makes an alliance with Ptolemy VI, pretending to support his claim to the throne. He sets him up as king in Memphis. He leaves a garrison in Pelusium and returns to Syria. And any plans he had to control Egypt through Ptolemy VI vanishes when the 2 brothers were reconciled through the efforts of their sister Cleopatra, and they became joint rulers of Egypt. That's what John Walton writes in the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary. So, where are we here? Okay. So all these kings, their hearts are bent on doing evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be. This is another one of those verses. The end, there it is. The end is at the end of time. No, it's the time of the end of what this is leading to, this time period of Syrian wars that leads to ultimately the Roman Empire. Verse 28, and he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. Ah, there's something with Israel. And he shall work his will. There it is again, that does his will and return to his own land. What is this? So when Antiochus defeats Egypt, you go on his way back from Egypt, Antiochus raids the temple treasury. Let me put this in better terms. Let me say it's Epiphanes, because we're still on the same Epiphanes. I don't want to confuse people here. That vile person, Antiochus Epiphanes, he raids the temple treasury in Jerusalem on the way back from Egypt. This is where 1 Maccabees 1, verses 20 through 28 talks about. It talks about this whole incident. He returns to Syria to prepare for a second attack on Egypt and Ptolemy VI. So that's what Daniel's talking about here, where he says, he returns to his land, Epiphanes does, with great wealth, but he sets his heart against the Holy Covenant. That's Jerusalem. And he shall work his will and return to his own land. So he goes back and prepares for war with Egypt. Verse 29, at the time appointed, because remember, God is in control. God appoints these times, right? At the time appointed, he shall return. Epiphanes shall return and come into the south or Egypt, but it shall not be this time as it was before. So remember I said Egypt, those two brothers were set against each other, but Cleopatra helped get them together again, and they co-ruled in Egypt. So when Epiphanes hears about the reconciliation between the two Ptolemies, he invades Egypt in 168 BC. He intends to besiege Alexandria. But it shall not be as it was before. Before, when he went into Egypt and conquered it, he took it back. Or, I mean, Epiphanes took it, right? But he still left them some control. But this time he's not going to win it. Why? Because verse 30, for ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. Ships of Kittim shall come against him. What's that? All right. At this time, Kittim, that word Kittim, is one of the words that denoted the islands and coasts off the Mediterranean west of Palestine. Sometimes it just meant anywhere west, but a lot of times it actually meant the ships of Rome. Kittim is often a pseudonym for Rome. And there's a lot of that occurs in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. They would call Rome Kittim. So what happened was Egypt appealed to Rome while Epiphanes is coming down. And the Roman populace, general, and other Roman ambassadors came in galleys and made Antiochus depart from Egypt. So Rome came out and said, Epiphanes, no way. You're not going to do this, and by now Rome's a powerful republic, right? But it's still not the next kingdom that Daniel it's going to be, but not yet. So there's from Rome that come against him and says, nope, you're going to withdraw. But he gets enraged, right? So here's what happens. Here's what John Walton writes. He says, a rumor that Antiochus Epiphanes had been killed in Egypt prompted, now we're back. Now let's go back to Israel for a second while this is going on. At this time, this is a time where the Maccabees are right. The book of Maccabees talks about this time period. And one of the Hellenistic priests, Jason, when he hears this rumor that Epiphanes was killed, so he goes, hey, I'm going to jump to this. And he attacks Jerusalem in an attempt to oust the high priest Menelaus, who's there at the time. Jason kills many in the city, but he fails to take full control of it. When Epiphanes heard of the trouble in Jerusalem, he assumed that the city was in revolt. So he moved to deal with it. An Assyrian force entered the city, perhaps by subterfuge, and slaughtered many. This now is where we're entering in where the book of Maccabees talks about where Antiochus Epiphanes comes and he destroys, takes over the temple, he defiles it, he sets up an altar to Zeus, right? This is what we're getting into now. And it's got this provocation as part of it. So he turns back and enraged and takes action against the Holy Covenant, meaning he takes action against Jerusalem, the holy city of the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. What does that mean? I think that's those who forsake the Holy Covenant are Hellenistic Jews. So Hellenism, which is basically Greco thought or Grecian culture, is taking over the whole land, right? Alexander the Great basically made everyone Greeks, right? So many of the Jews adopted that. They say, hey, let's go along. We can incorporate this with our Judaism. Many Jews did not, but many Jews did. And they called them the Hellenistic Jews, which means they wanted to, much like the first century Jews wanted to, be in league with Rome. So these Jews wanted to be in league with the Greek culture and get along with it without rejecting their own. But Daniel's saying, no, they were forsaking the Holy Covenant by trying to unite with pagans. They were forsaking the Holy Covenant. And they come into play in this time of the Maccabees as well. Verse 31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Aha. So here's the first abomination of desolation. Notice this is happening in the time of Epiphanes, which is not the same as the abomination of desolation in Daniel 9, which occurs in the time of Titus, the Roman, right? So this is that phrase, that repetitious phrase, which we've already explained pretty well in the past. So I won't go into it again, but this is what's describing what happened in Epiphanes. And most scholars actually do agree with this. In fact, I think what I neglected to mention was, as you're seeing all these incredible details that are actually quite true to history, this passage is one of the reasons why liberal scholarship, critical scholarship, tends to argue that Daniel was written after the Maccabean conflict to make it look like it was prophesied before the Maccabean conflict.
Because there's no way it could actually be prophecy.
There's no way that you can know that detail of history before it happens, which, if you think about it, that's sort of a tacit admission that it really does match up with history. Now, obviously, they're trying to argue the opposite, but it shows that at least they're admitting that it matches up with history. So if you can prove that Daniel was written beforehand, then you've really got him. Now, that's unfortunately, that's another discussion, but yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of fascinating. So getting back to, okay, so 31. So profaning the temple and the fortress. So probably at this time, there was a citadel called the Acra, and it was built near the temple to house the Syrian troops. And I think this might be similar to, in the first century, they had that Antonia fortress right next to the temple, and they built that in order to keep watch over them, right? Well, I think that this is what the Greeks did, something similar, but they called the citadel called Acra. And what happens is Epiphanes he goes back home, but he makes an edict that prescribes, which means he prohibits Jewish practices on pain of death. He stops the sacrifices. He says, no more sacrifices in temple, no more Sabbaths. You cannot follow your festivals. You cannot get circumcised, and you cannot follow your food laws. Not only that, but all copies of Torah that they could find were hunted down and burned. So this is why Antiochus Epiphanes is called the vile person, the abomination of desolation, right? Because he attacks the holy covenant of God, right? And in the past, where we looked at in, what was it, Daniel 7, I think it was. No, Daniel 9, I think, no, Daniel 8, all this stuff, where it talks about, remember how we talked about how same guy, Epiphanes, it was talking about he would rise to even go against the heavenly host and the host of the prince of hosts himself. In other words, for him to do this against the temple and against the entire religion of Judaism was to attack the very God himself. That's what's going on. That's why Epiphanes is also the model for futurists who think there's an antichrist. They think, he's the sort of the role model, and he is a role model for Titus, who was the abomination of desolation in the first century, as we've already seen. So this is not a dual fulfillment. This is not, the abomination is fulfilled twice. No, the phrase abomination of desolation is simply any time that a pagan ruler violates and desolates the holy temple, he's an abomination of desolation, right? And so there's different prophecies of different abominations, desolations, and that we're talking about Epiphanes here, right? So That's what happened. So this is why the book of Maccabees, first, second Maccabees was written. And I haven't read third, so I don't know, but Maccabees is very interesting. And I recommend Christians read it because it's part of the Apocrypha. You don't have to accept it as scripture, but it is history. Basically, there's some legend in there, but it's basically history about a very crucial time period that Daniel's prophesying about. So it's really cool. I read it, and it's very interesting. So he profanes the temple, and he sets up the abomination of desolation. What is that? Well, this is usually taken to be a reference to a idol of Zeus being put in the temple, which was claimed to have occurred. But John Day makes another interesting argument that I think, is a fuller expression of what that fulfillment was. So first of all, this event of Epiphanies violating stopping the offering and profaning the temple with abomination we talked about in Daniel 8 verses 11 through 14. That's where we were talking about earlier. I found the verse here, so this is this is the years later. He's recapitulating, reminding us, telling us some new facts about the things that are going to happen, because he's talking about the same four kingdoms over and over. Now, John Day says, we know from 1 Maccabees 1:54 and 59 that the cult object here, this abomination that makes desolate, he says it's not that it was the abomination that makes desolate is the statue of Zeus, but rather the term was that referred to an altar, a pagan altar that was set up on top of the altar of burnt offerings that was in the temple courtyard. So what happened was Epiphanes set up a pagan altar on top of the God's altar, and there may have been a statue of Zeus as part of that. But my point here is that it's more important than just the statue. It's an altar to that false god, which is the ultimate abomination to God on God's altar. So that's what happens then. Then verse 32, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, those Hellenistic Jews, right? So, Epiphanes flatters them. He leads them along, right? But the people who, so just to remind you, Epiphanes makes all these things illegal, from, circumcision, Sabbaths. These are the most holy obedience of the Jews, right? And the Hellenistic Jews were able to survive that, right? They're flattered, right? But the people who know their God, says Daniel in verse 33, shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand. For some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. The people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. What happens is the revolt of Judas Maccabeus. That's the book of Maccabees. Talks about the Maccabean revolt. So this is where the Judeans defeat the forces of Antiochus Epiphanes and pushes him back. Here's what the Zondervan pictorial commentary says. The main organized rebellion against Epiphanes was led by the Hasmon family. You'll hear this phrase, the Hasmoneans, in the 1st century. They come from the Maccabeans. When a Syrian envoy came to their town, Modin, to enforce Epiphanes' edict, right, to no more obedience to the commands of God, and you have to, also part of it was that you had to slaughter animals on a pagan altar in each of the towns, right? The head of a family, a priest named Mattathias, killed that Syrian envoy, which is the start of a war, right? So the family of Mattathias flees and becomes a rallying point for other rebels. So other Jews follow him because they're encouraged. Oh, he stood up against the evil abomination, right? So they started to grow a little army, basically, right? And Mattathias had 5 sons who would become important if you read the book of Maccabees. They became a rallying point for other rebels. Judas, one of Mattathias' 5 sons, becomes the military commander. That's why you hear Judas Maccabeus, and that's where you hear the nickname Maccabeus. So Maccabees is a nickname, actually, and it means the hammer. So his nickname was actually Judas the Hammer. His name wasn't Maccabeus. That was his nickname, which I find kind of fascinating. Judas the Hammer. That's why it got that name. because the defeats he inflicted on the Syrian forces sent against the rebels. So when they rise up and rebel, Syrian forces come, but they get slaughtered. And in December of 164 BC, about 3 years after the abomination of desolation, right? Judas regained control of Jerusalem, purified the temple, and resumed the sacrifices. So that's what we read about earlier in Daniel 8. And this is what happens as a result of the Maccabean conflict. They become victorious in 3 years, gain back the temple, and restore those sacrifices. We talked about that with the, what was it, 1230 days or something like that. So that's where he says they shall take firm and take action. That's the war. And then it says, and the wise among the people shall make many understand. That's the Maccabeans who begin the revolt. And it leads to Judean semi-autonomy. Now, they're not totally autonomous, but they have a certain amount of it because of this. Though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. So this is a reference to the fact that the revolt was short-lived and conflict with Syria continues for many years. All right, so that's why I say it's semi-autonomy, because the Maccabees have some success, but they're continually, after that, they're continually plagued with wars with Syria and other nations and civil wars until the time of Julius Caesar, which will be the next kingdom, right? So John Walton says the persecution of faithful Jews by Antiochus Epiphanes' agents and collaborators is described vividly in 1 Maccabees 1 and 2 and 2 Maccabees 6 through 7. You can read about that stuff there. Kind of cool. Well, not cool, I mean, brutal, but. Okay, so now we're on to verse 34. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. What does that mean? Well, the Maccabean revolt begins well, but it's eventually corrupted. They rise up, they restore Torah, but the Hellenistic Jews are still there, and they ultimately end up corrupting. They join themselves with flattery. That's the Hellenistic Jews. It's, you know, and Daniel's using the concept of flattery as the idea that they compromise with them, and in so doing, they're actually going to bring out their underhanded destruction. And some of the wise shall stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. What's that? Okay. Well, in the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says this: the Maccabean movement is purged in order to prepare a remnant for the time of the Messiah. So as a result of the Maccabean revolt, a new phase of the Maccabean rule had emerged. Although the term Hasmonean is sometimes applied to the whole of the Maccabean family, it is more strictly applied to the high priestly house from the line of Simon until 63 BC, the time of Julius Caesar. Judas had already achieved religious freedom, and Jonathan, another one of the brothers of sons of Mattathias, had become both the religious leader by being appointed high priest and the political leader by becoming the sole ruler over Judea by ousting the Hellenistic elements. Simon attempted and achieved complete independence from the Seleucid rule. This independence endured until Rome's intervention in 63 BC. And Pompey's capture of Jerusalem 79 years later, in 63 BC, ended Hasmonean rule. So this Maccabean revolt results in this Hasmonean rule, but it's mixture. It's got Hellenism, and it becomes corrupted, and ultimately it's going to be overtaken by Romans. And by the time of Romans, then we're going to have the Herods, which we'll get to in a bit, but they become the sort of the powers of Israel, and they are also the ultimate Hellenistic Jews, right? But now we're kind of getting. Oh, you know what? Yeah, good. Okay, we're at the end. Okay. So we're good timing. There's just so much. I'm just going through verse by verse. Now, the next part of Daniel 11, the last part of it, is now going to talk about the next kingdom, which is ancient Rome, according to Daniel's chronology, right? The verse says, and the king shall do as he wills. There it is again. The king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself against every god, blah, blah, blah. This is with the grammar of Daniel, it's just so confusing here. It's like, this is where some problems are caused exegetically. Now, most conservative scholars will acknowledge that the context of the texts indicates that this is a new king. And I'm going to argue it is. We're going to see next episode that it is in reference to the Roman kingdom, but who exactly we're not, I'm not going to say we're not sure, but there are different versions which are going to be very fascinating. But it's using that phrase, the king shall do as he wills again. Why? Because this is another king who acts like a god, right? And the liberals, this is where the liberals say this is still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. But they admit that the rest of this passage in 11 is talking all about this willful king, but they admit that it doesn't fit Epiphanes' reign. So this is why they say the book was written shortly after the Maccabean conflict. And that's why they get all these other details correct. But then the writer doesn't know what's going to happen in the future. And he tries to project into the future what's going to happen. So, right. So he's trying to project this next, what's going to happen with Epiphanes, but he was wrong. See, that's why liberals say, oh, see, so the writer's wrong here because it doesn't fit Epiphanes. Well, that's the liberal view that believes this is all about Epiphanes, but the confessing scholars have a different approach, and they understand this is the context this is a new king. Now, is this a king thousands of years in the future, which some of the futurists will actually argue? No. And we'll talk about that next episode. It's the very next kingdom of Rome. Who it is, that's the big question. But just like Daniel's kingdoms follow one after the other, and these kings are roughly one after the other within those kingdoms, it makes perfect contextual sense that the next kingdom is the next king that does as he wills is a very important Roman king that has to do with the arrival of the Messiah. So we'll talk about that and next week, and that king leads into Daniel 12, which has to do with the 1st century. Hope that baits you, because most people assume that Daniel 12, oh, that's obviously in our future, thousands of years later. No, it actually is the next kingdom of ancient Rome, and you'll see why in the next episode.
How much time do you think passed between verse 1 here in 11 and verse 35 where we ended?
Well, the Syrian wars. Okay, let me see here. Daniel 11.
The reason why I'm asking, just to set the stage, is because I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, there are a lot of people that are better students of scripture growing up than I was, but I just I get, like the church that I come from and the Southern Baptist tradition, the way that you go through Daniel and youth group real quick, we read this almost like it's just a depiction of a battle that takes a week or a month. Like when I would go through these passages in Daniel, very rarely did I look at this as the history of an entire kingdom. It was like, I feel stupid for admitting that out loud, but
me too.
But I mean, when I read this, just like as an ignorant person, just saying I'm reading my Bible today and I'm going through Daniel and not really doing any research on it, you read it like it's just an event that took place within a single week. It's like, oh, well, then this happens, and then that happens, and then this happens, and that happens. And before long, you're waiting for the one event that happens in history, like as a futurist, the one event where this all comes to fruition in a day.
Yeah.
And
well, no, that's a very good point. Quite frankly, I even thought that too. And because I never studied it, I just heard the futuristic descriptions, and it just fit. You just, oh, okay, it seems to make sense. And actually, there's a lot of people actually do agree. Both liberals and conservatives often agree on the basic definition, or not definition, the basic interpretation that I just gave you.
Right.
It's very similar. It's kind of interesting. But so what you're asking, what we talked about today, the first Syrian war, there's 6 Syrian wars that we walked through. And the first Syrian war started around 274 BC. The last Syrian war, which we talked about, which was all about the Maccabean conflict, right? That ended around 168, 167 BC. So that covered a year of covered a time period of what? 110 odd years or something like that.
oh my
Right.
gosh.
So, but the end, so now we're up to around 168, 167 BC. The next king that takes place, so the next kingdom is ancient Rome. And Rome as a republic, Rome doesn't become an empire. I mean, it's still a kingdom, right? But it doesn't
Right.
become an empire until Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is around the time period of Julius and the lines of Caesars. They reign around, what was it, 49 BC, something like that. And so Julius and the line of Caesars is one of the interpretations of what this is. Another is Herod. And Herod was under the time of Augustus and which is, right after Caesar. He's around 37 BC. So, and a third option might be Titus, which he's later in AD 66. But nevertheless, from the end of the Sixth Syrian War, where we just ended, was roughly 167 BC. So if the next one is the Roman Empire, then we're talking another, 130 years, 130 some odd years, right? Somewhere 130 some odd years before Julius Caesar arrives. So that would be a little bit of a gap, right? Does that mean they're dispensational? See, you put a gap in there? No, because there's no gaps between the kingdoms. That's the point is Rome is the next kingdom. And there's a few years, 139 years, but the next kingdom that is relevant is Rome, and the Roman kingdoms have a lot to do with the kingdom of Israel. So there really is no jump other than in years of kings, no jump in kingdom years, but sure, there's a different, we mentioned this before, the Bible doesn't have to talk about every single king in line, right? I mean, come on, don't be ridiculous. But it talks about every continuous kingdom. So that's that.
Interesting. Well, that is mind-blowing.
Next week is going to be climactic. We've had some really interesting episodes here, but the last episode is going to be really controversial, but very fascinating. So it just keeps getting better in our Daniel study. How's that?
Yeah, it is fascinating. I'm kind of blown away that just between verse 1 and 35, we have possibly 110 years. That's just mind-blowing to me. So I just got the warning on my computer that my internet connection was unstable. I don't know if my voice was coming through clear or not, but all right, guys. Well, that's it. We've got Daniel 10 and 11 verses 1 through 35 taken care of tonight. We'll pick back up at the end of 11 next week, and then we'll just keep pushing along. So Brian, remind everybody what your website is. And
Godawa.com. Look, you guys, I've got a great books on eschatology. If you want the straight theology, you can go to End Times Bible Prophecy, where I give my personal journey of prophecy and understanding a preterist viewpoint. And there's other little books connected to that you can get for free, actually, if you get that book. But also my novel series called Chronicles of the Apocalypse, which is a fictional tale taking place in the true history of the first century, and explains how the ancient Christians of the first century understood the book of Revelation written by John in their time period. And so I have John and I have the martyrs, the apostles being martyred, Nero persecuting the Christians, all that stuff is going on. And while John has finished his book of Revelation, so I bring all that story to life with a novel, and then I have footnotes from the book of Revelation and from scholarship to help show you where I'm getting my interpretations from. So if you love a good, exciting, romance, action, adventure, Hollywood epic, but also some good, strong theology, Chronicles of the Apocalypse will help explain this theology of the end times that we're talking about, even in Daniel, which is also connected to Revelation, but specifically Revelation. I talk a little bit about Daniel throughout that series, but specifically Revelation, you get this understanding of the preterist viewpoint from a dramatic narrative, which will make sense unlike anything you've ever read in systematic theology.
Well, and I've listened to
did I say Godawa.com? But all my books are in paperback, ebook, and audiobook exclusively on Amazon.com.
Well, and I listened to all 4 of the Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and I actually really enjoyed them. I honestly enjoy books sometimes more when the author reads them than me reading them, because the author, I don't know, the author knows how to read their writing. Sometimes that's enjoyable. So, guys, I really enjoyed the audible version of Chronicles of the Apocalypse, all 4 of those books, so go check them out. Also, don't forget, we've got a big sponsor of the show, Al, with MovitaOils.com. He's given us a promo code TTB20. It's a lifetime promo code. You can use it every time on his website, movitaoils.com. You will save 20% off every order, no matter how much you order, no matter how often you order. If you're hanging out with us on Through the Black, that promo code is for you. You can even give it to your friends, your family. It doesn't matter. Go save some money on CBD and help us out. So guys, thanks for hanging out with us tonight. And we will be back in another week, Lord willing, to bring you the next part of the series on Daniel. Hope you're enjoying it. We certainly enjoyed doing it. It's a good time, and I always learn a lot. I hope you do too. Thanks, guys. Love you. Peace.